You are listening to Abundance Hack Podcast, where we talk about alchemy, transmuting life's challenges into gold. We talk about embodiment, being all of who we are in our fullness and not shrinking for the comfort of others. That is living an abundant life. Hey lovers, I am so excited about this episode. I am back with Cheri Calico. If you didn't listen to that episode, definitely go check it out. We talked about gene keys, we talked about human design, but today we are talking about relationships, different dynamics in relationships, and I am so excited to dive into this topic. How are you?
I am wonderful. How are you?
I'm amazing. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we dive into this topic, I want to ask you, what does healthy love mean to you?
Wow. Great question. Healthy love to me, it means beginning with healthy individuals. And
Mm,
so it means coming into wholeness as individuals, healing our past childhood and familial pathologies, and then coming into sacred union with another to experience love.
I love that. I love that. I feel like the term sacred union is the perfect segue to dive into this topic. So, we are programmed to believe that a relationship looks a certain way. There's so much programming around it. And what I found for myself is when I started peeling the layers back of what is actually my core desire and what was programmed into me, I discovered a whole other world that we're gonna dive into. But why before we dive into like what this other world is, why do you feel so many people only have like one view of what a relationship should look like or what a sacred union should look like?
Well, I think we have a lot of ideas about what relationships should look like just based off of our societal norms, right? And also our family patterns, what we witness day to day. And I think we haven't really experienced sacred union during our timeline yet. I think we're
Mm,
shifting into that, which is why we're seeing a lot of disruption of the relationship structures that supported hierarchy and patriarchy and power structures within familial units that made those units patriarchal in nature, right? So I think we're seeing kind of the deconstruction of that during our timeline for the very first time, which I think is ushering in the capacity and the frequency to welcome in sacred union.
So if someone listening is like, okay, well, what is sacred union if we haven't really experienced it in our lifetime? How would you explain that?
So interestingly enough, we're using a lot of the buzzwords, right? We're using divine femininity all the time. We're using divine masculinity a lot. We're kind of seeing that language starting to infiltrate what I call like our collective algorithm,
Mm,
right? So we're seeing the language. Unfortunately, right, we all have to start at the ground floor. So mostly if you were, born a woman, you are going to lean more into, okay, how can I awaken my divine femininity? And for a man, it's on the opposite side. Sacred union supports the notion that we both have feminine and masculine qualities, and it's about coming into wholeness within yourself, balancing your own feminine and masculine energetics, and then coming into sacred union with someone who has done the same thing. So they have, formed a level of spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical and fully embodied completion within themselves. And so it allows for a different type of union oneness, right? Because we're no longer following the model of, I'm looking for someone to complete me,
mm-hmm.
right? So that's what sacred union is really about. It's about coming whole, coming complete, and so that you can enter into a relationship where 1 plus 1 no longer equals two, I say. 1 plus 1 equals three. There's me, there's you, and then there's the org field that we create when we come together.
I love that. There are so many little gems in what you just said. And I used to say, when people say, oh, this is my better half, or like, this is my other half, I used to not, I'm never like that. Like, it never resonated with me. And I'm like, but I'm not a half. Like, I'm a whole person and I want to be with a whole person. So I love that you said that. And also, I remember my therapist was talking about when she works with couples, the actual relationship is the client. And so it speaks to what you just said about where the sacred union is almost like an entity in itself,
Right.
basically.
Absolutely.
So I found for myself that when I started my embodiment work and really understanding who I am, what I want, what I truly desire, I felt like a lot of the relationships that I was in, I couldn't be all of myself. I felt like I had to shrink. And I think that there's a lot of programming that tells women they have to shrink, they have to be easygoing, and they have to be sweet, and they have to be a little more silent. Like, speaking up is not necessarily okay. And so when I really started peeling these layers back, I realized that there's not a lot of men, in my personal experience, my lived experience, that can handle an embodied woman. And this was kind of my perspective for a while. And then I discovered this thing that I reached out to you about, and I'm like, we got to talk about this. So, the thing that I discovered is FLRs, so a female led relationship. And I had to really understand what this is. And I think when I went down the rabbit hole, I realized there's a whole entire world out there that for some reason I just didn't know anything about. And there's people that don't subscribe to the traditional relationships that are based in misogyny and patriarchy. So when I discovered this, I'm like, where has this been my whole adult life? And I'm completely fascinated, and I don't think that I can ever be in any other type of relationship after figuring out this one dynamic. So yeah, let's dive into female-led relationships.
I'm excited.
So I think that there's definitely a version of it that's more on the kink side, but I think outside of like the kink, so we think about like sub dom. Like, I asked a man, when you hear the phrase a man that's of service to his queen, what do you think? And he was like, oh, that's like a sub dom dynamic. And I was like, that's really interesting that a man being of service to his woman is considered a kink. Like, why is this not just like how it should be? A man should want to pour into his woman and have her be the best version of herself and be of service. So like, why is this like so taboo? So I really want to dive into like how society has programmed us to think that it's a kink, it's a unorthodox thing, because so much of our society is programmed in misogyny and patriarchy. So I know I just said a lot. First, what is your definition of an FLR?
So, my definition of an FLR is really a relationship where the woman's voice and wisdom is central to how the relationship functions. I think when we think of like FLRs in a certain through a certain lens, it usually is people thinking of like who's leading in the relationship, right? Because female-led relationship. But then I review like what does leadership truly mean to me? And when I think of leadership going from being in the hands of the masculine to being in the hands of the feminine, I believe that women we lead differently, right? We lead from a space of empathy and strategy and compassion and support. And so that's what I really believe female-led relationships to be centering when we talk about, shifting that kind of leadership dynamic from the masculine into the hands of the feminine is really shifting also what leadership means in and of itself.
I love that. Yeah, so when you think about a traditional relationship and like the man providing, I think that when people first hear FLR, they're thinking like, okay, well, the man, like, is the man staying home and cooking, cleaning, and things like that. And it's not really about that, right?
Right. It's not about that, right? I think that even if in society the roles look more traditional, I think when it comes to leadership, it really is about that the decision making, it's honoring the feminine intuition, right? It's honoring the realities that the feminine has typically been the leader of the home, right? It's funny because when you file taxes and the person who writes head of household is who makes the most money. But we know that historically, the feminine has been the head in the household, right? The matriarchal figure. She knows everything about the people who live there, their wants, their needs, their desires, their dreams, when their birthdays are, who their doctors are, all of those things, the organization of the home, right? She knows all of those things. Who's spiritually guiding the unit, the relationship that typically, again, has fallen into the lap of the feminine, who is more so attuned to those things. Who's setting the tone of the relationship emotionally, right? And so, because the feminine is typically the one who is doing that type of interpersonal work first. I don't necessarily know if the masculine has had the opportunity to develop fully in that way, in the ways that the feminine collective has. And so it makes sense that that would be a transition or a transfer of leadership, even a transfer of power in the relationship when it comes to certain things.
Yeah. And I feel like we all know that at our core, right? The woman is the person who is handling, like making the house a home. Like we always knew that. So it's so interesting to me, like when I zoom out of how men feel like women are inferior, right? Like when really like the women are the leadership, like in that leadership position anyway, but it's like I almost feel like we're not given that recognition, when you think about how many women don't feel seen, they don't feel heard by their partners, their spouses. So for me, the difference in an FLR is the men that want to be in this relationship dynamic, they realize women are powerful, women are queens, women are goddesses, they birth life, they are that divine energy that takes, you know, a a house and like really makes it a home and adds that compassion. So when you look at men that want to be in FLRs, usually they're so much more, what's a word I can use? Appreciative of women versus traditional men that I'll say are kind of stuck in toxic masculinity. They're more degrading to women, and women are a possession, and women are like arm candy, right? Versus like a man that wants to be in an FLR views women as sacred. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think the man who chooses an FLR, he definitely views the feminine as sacred. And through that sacredness, I believe that he uncovers a deeper mystery, which I think the traditional man has been taught that the structure in place that society has set up is going to provide him the things that the man in the FLR knows that if he tunes into his feminine counterpart and allows her to lead, he will be led to those things anyway through her. Right? I truly believe that the feminine is the portal to all of the things that the traditional man is chasing outside of the home.
And I don't even think a lot of them even know it.
Which is interesting because I always like to say, like, I'm very spiritual, I'm very woo-woo, I'm very much on the priestess path, but I'm also like 50% logical. And so I love numbers, I love data, and all of the billionaires and millionaires are married. Right? Like this is, statistically true. Over 90% of, billionaires are married. Over 80% of millionaires are married. right? And so I think that that's been a thing that has set up the structure of relationships and households. The thing that has been such a crux has been the money, right? Especially when it comes to when we're talking about domestic labor and we're talking about how we're structuring families and households, it has been, oh, the man's in charge because he holds the purse strings, right? Women couldn't even have their own bank accounts until 1974. And so, of course, that was the way that these relationships were structured, was through the oppression of feminine energy. Because the structured ways that our relationships are structured, it says, if you go out here and you work and you achieve as a traditional masculine man, you essentially get a slave.
Mm,
You get free labor. You get
mm,
someone to birth your legacy through, right? You get someone to oppress. And of course, that would be in the, at least in the Western society we live in, right? That would be the structure that we would breed into our families because that's how our country was built.
mm. Yeah. What I find, I hear a lot of men saying these days is, I want a woman who doesn't need me. What do you think about when you hear that?
I think that's an interesting concept, right? Like I I understand the desire to not be needed in an unhealthy capacity. I'll say that,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that there's a lot of fear currently around responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of empathy and compassion for the ways that men have been caged by patriarchy and misogyny themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? They don't oftentimes see it, but there is a lot of pressure to be this masculine counterpart who, makes 10 times more than your woman counterpart, can protect, can provide, can do all of these things, right? And so I have empathy and compassion for that. And I think that that's where that desire comes from, the desire to, quote, not be needed. It really is coming from that desire to ease that pressure that shows up.
Mm-hmm. When I think about that, I feel there is a gap because if men don't want to provide financially, they have to be able to provide emotionally. And I think that there's a lack of emotional intelligence in men right now. And they are doing the work. So the last episode that just aired on Abundance Hack was a man talking about doing shadow work, going to men's group. So there are more and more men opening up to this concept, but I think that there's still a large number of men that are like, I don't want to have to provide because, the economy's hard, like inflation, everything. Like it's harder now to provide for a whole entire household. But if you're not providing financially and you don't have the emotional intelligence to provide emotional safety or emotional support, what else is there besides sex? And I said on, a previous episode, sex by itself is not enough. And women are finding themselves unfulfilled in relationships because men no longer want to be needed. What do you think about that?
Think you're hitting the nail on the head. I think that I know that most men were not socialized for that type of intimacy, right? For that type of emotional closeness. And their capacity is deeply stunted by the reality that toxic masculinity, it doesn't just affect women, it infiltrates all of society, right? And so I think most men do find themselves at that crossroads where even if you are developing yourself spiritually and emotionally, you are still told that this is who you are supposed to be in society. And if you're not shown up, if you do not show up as this version of man or as masculine in society, then you do not reap the benefits and rewards that you have been promised since childhood, right? There has to be some, yellow brick road being paved for them with all of these things at the other side. If you are this type of man, you get this type of woman, you get this type of family, you get these type of rewards. right? And so I absolutely believe that men are kind of finding themselves exposing the trap that patriarchy laid for them as well, right? Because at first it was meant to oppress and cage the feminine, but in building that cage, they built the cage from the inside out, and now they're trapped inside of it.
That was so good. That was so good. Oh my goodness, that was so good. I never thought about it that way, but I have started paying attention and like listening to men, but also listening to people who are supporting men doing the inner work. And the same way women have to step outside of the box of like be the sweet girl next door and be silent and be easygoing, and we have this box that they put us in, but also for men it's the same thing, like be tough and consume and don't have feelings, like emotion is weakness, like they've been programmed to fit in a box as well. So I love how you said that. So what do you feel like are the action steps for men to break free of that?
I think that action steps for them breaking free of that is for them to not fall into the seductive frequency of victimhood. I think that that feels like that's where the tides are turning. When I hear like a lot of the rhetoric that's coming through the algorithm now is, men feeling victimized by women wanting them to provide and needing them to provide and even wanting them to show up traditionally because something shifted, right? Just 5 to 10 years ago, there was a really large movement of independent women, right? We can do it by ourselves, women building businesses, and emphasis on entrepreneurship. And what happened is we hit a point of burnout. And then we saw this influx that we're still kind of contending with, which is like the soft girl era, right? Where there was kind of this reversion back to traditionalism, back to women looking for providers. African American women finally saying, hey, we want hypergamy too, right? Every other race of woman has hypergamy kind of set up into their infrastructure, but we don't necessarily have that, right? And so you have these women kind of coming online saying we want these things from our counterparts, right? And these things that they want from their counterparts are the things that they were, promised through this lens of traditionalism, right? And so I think that the men are also sending out a frequency of, I want a submissive woman, I want a soft woman, right? I want access to this type of archetype of feminine. However, there's a cost associated with that, right? I call it like you want to set yourself up to play the game of traditionalism. And that game is, as the man, work will equal money, which will equal access to this type of woman. And women didn't set that structure in place. And I think that that's why a lot of men who don't look at it through that nuance of like, hey, the masculine created this structure, right? The feminine was made to plug into it, right? Because we didn't, I mean, this is just facts. We just didn't have the rights to do anything different, right? And so now that the feminine is saying, hey, you want me to be this type of feminine archetype, I need you to be this type of man. And so they have to contend with that within themselves, within the masculine collective of what are we truly asking for. A lot of the work that I do with men is really re-empowering them to find out and figure out who they are at their core so that they can communicate that clearly, because communicating their wants, their needs, their desires is not something that they were socialized to do, right? They're oftentimes socialized through the lens of, grin and bear it, right? Man up. How can you express what it is that you're actually feeling and going through. And so I think we're in the stage of contending with the confusion of the world feels like it's going to hell in a handbasket, right? Eggs are $10. And then,
If you could even
they're going,
find eggs these days.
right. And then these men, they're going online and they're seeing the sheer sevens of the world, right? They're seeing this influx of the soft girl era also honestly intermingle with sex worker lingo, right? Conversations that the feminine used to have behind closed doors and in our sister circles are being had on podcasts and on public platforms like TikTok. And I'll say this, I just don't think that men need to be privy to these conversations of the feminine mystery. Some things were meant to be mysterious for a reason.
Wait, can you be more specific on what you're referring to around that?
So I think that there is a lot of rhetoric around, okay, how you should make yourself look, how you should dress, how you should speak to men, how to seduce them. And all of these are public conversations that to the masculine feel like women communicating how to manipulate them. The feminine knows that that's not what it is, but the masculine can't receive that. There are certain feminine mysteries that are not meant to be publicly displayed to them, right? Because there are things that are meant to inspire them, right? That are meant to seduce them, that are meant to energize them into action, right? Those are all feminine mysteries and conversations we used to have with our mothers and our grandmothers and our sisters, right? And that we would, have parlors about and we would talk about it in our inner circles. But now this is on public display and the men are hearing it through the masculine lens. And it sounds like manipulation. It sounds harmful. It sounds hurtful, right? For to hear a woman online say a man has to make this this certain amount of money so that I can maintain myself in this way. And maybe those are conversations that they're valid conversations to have, but are they healthy conversations to have amongst the collective?
I feel like that is a huge, huge, huge topic in itself. But it makes me think about something I've been saying, that so much of our relationships are based in manipulation anyway. So, what I do feel is that while it's probably not healthy, it's like the wool is being removed from our eyes, because men feel manipulated by women, but women also feel manipulated by men because men manipulate women with money and power and status, So what it's doing, in my opinion, is exposing the transactional nature of our relationships. And it happens across the board, not just in, like women that men always talk about, like, I don't want a sugar baby, or I don't want to be anyone's sugar daddy type of thing. But even beyond that, when you get into marriage, if a man buys, a new couch, he has expectations when he comes home from his wife. And so much of our relationships are based in manipulation, control, and that transactional nature. And when I think about what a sacred union means to me, it doesn't feel transactional, you know?
Right. I, I think that what we are kind of contending with is women's beauty isn't going away, right? The femininity isn't going away. The wisdom isn't going away. However, the things that the toxic masculine was rooted in, power, money, posturing, those things are starting to crumble, right? Those things that were once promised to the masculine are no longer something that they have easy access to, because those things are not internal, right? Which is why I say the things that we say women utilize to manipulate men, they're more inherent, right? Because at one point, for the feminine, manipulation was simply inspiration, right? How do we inspire men into action? How do we guide men into action? How do we get them to listen? right? And this is a part of a lot of mythology and religious practices when you really get into it, of women having these moments with strong and powerful men where they utilize their womanly wiles, not to manipulate them in a dangerous way, but to be the muse, be the inspiration, right? And so I think that there is this imbalance where the resources that the women have, it's not it's not going anywhere, right? It's a natural resource, right? Whereas the resources that the men have, we are now seeing it kind of be stripped away. So it's interesting. And when we think of sacred union and things being transactional, when you have people not entering into unions at all, right? Marriage rates are lower, are lower than they've ever been, right? So people aren't necessarily coming into any kind of union, not even the business contractual union of westernized marriage anymore. And so now you have two single individuals who have, I mean, typically been single most of their lives, right? This is the first generation where people have been single this long, right? Have been single and have never been married before, right? And so you have people who have not only come into themselves, but they have come into themselves and been supporting themselves as an individual for so long that that idea of like, how do we even come into this type of merger that was the traditional marriage, it typically doesn't always make sense for people anymore, right? Like if you're 30 plus and you own your own home, and this person's 30 plus and they own their own home, and you've been in relationships, you've lived your own lives, some people have children, some people don't, right? This is a non-traditional way of living versus like when my parents were married and they knew each other since they were 14, grew up in the same neighborhood, and were married in their early 20s. They grew up together. That's a different strategy. That's a different life.
Yeah, and it makes sense why relationship the it makes sense why marriages are struggling and why people are staying single or opting to not get married. It makes a lot of sense, and I hear people blaming it on things like social media and the dating apps, but it's really not. Like, the old paradigms are crumbling, and I think a lot of people are flailing to find their way now because the traditional relationship structure just doesn't work anymore. So people are thinking that a 50-50 structure is better, and there's a term that I just discovered, egalitarian, meaning that equality. But I said this in a previous episode, I actually don't believe in equality. It'll never be 50-50. Women give birth, women have cycles. Like, if both if both individuals are working 40 hours a week, but then the woman has to work 40 hours that week, but she's on her period, you expect the same of her. To me, just, it doesn't resonate. So I don't think things will ever just be 50-50. And I feel like men wanting that and not seeing how it's not 50-50 is some programming that they're still working through. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't believe in equality either, but I do believe in equitability. So things being fair, right? So that means that if you make $200,000 and I make $50,000, we can't go 50-50 on the rent, right? The percentages are going to look different. And I think that looking towards equitability is important. And then I think there also needs to be a resurgence of healthy interdependence and finding out what that looks like. Just last night, I was watching a video just about, I'm not a mother, but there are a lot of mothers starting to talk about the labor of the household. And there was this really funny video going around like a few years ago from the Tonight Show where there was someone interviewing all of these dads that they met on the street. And they were asking them simple questions, just like, what's your child's birthday? Who's your child's best friend? What school do they go to? What's their teacher's name? And when I tell you, majority of them bombed, could not answer those questions. And then the mothers who were there were just like acing it across the board.
Mm,
And that is not a showing of like, oh, men are terrible, dads are terrible, moms are great. No, it just shows that there is still an imbalance of the expectation of labor when it comes to the feminine, when it comes to the masculine, and specifically when we are talking about creating familial units, right? There's just not the same level of expectation. When the pandemic happened, and schools were closing, the expectation wasn't that the dads would stay home and homeschool the kids. It was the moms. Like everyone was looking towards the women, like, are you going to stay home? Even the women who made more than their husbands at the time
mm,
were looked at like that they were going to be the ones who stay home with the children. That
mm.
was the social and relational expectation. And so when we're talking about, being egalitarian, or, what fairness looks like, we have to really peel back how we were socialized and start talking about, what our beliefs are, yeah, like bare bones, right?
Yeah,
What is fair? What is equitable when we know that we live in a society that is not?
yeah. And I think it's really important that men have this conversation without getting defensive and really listen to women, because anytime I try to have this conversation with a man, it does not go well. They get defensive and they and I know that it's ego, and I don't believe that ego is a bad thing. It's to protect their inner child. And if it's challenging the programming that was instilled in them, I can see why the ego is flaring up in that space. But I think it's really important for men to do shame resilience and shadow work to be able to have these conversations with women without it threatening their manhood, right? Because I feel like that's kind of what they're feeling when these conversations come up, but you can't sweep them under the rug and pretend that this is not something important to discuss.
Oh, absolutely. And I think they feel it in their bodies, right? When you talk about that shame, there's a lot of guilt. There's also a lot of that inner child work that
Mm-hmm.
I honestly believe women have more access to. And
Yeah.
that's just the truth of it, right? We are socialized to have friend groups. We're socialized to maintain our relationships with our families, right? Men are not socialized to engage in intimacy outside of their romantic connections.
Yeah.
And so, what we are asking of them, I think it does require, of course, this is their labor, it is personal. But if you're deciding to be in relationship with men, and that is something that you feel up to the task for, recreating what it is even like for them to have a conversation in which they are heard, where it's not necessarily them being talked at, but it's more of an exploration. Like, can we explore these things together? Because I think it quickly dissolves into conflict, and you versus me and man versus woman. And
Mm-hmm.
my thing is, we're on the same team.
Mm-hmm.
I am on your side, right? I think that's where we have to get back to. If my desire is sacred union and oneness, this isn't a you problem. You're not the monster who's hiding beneath my bed. And I think there are a lot of men who feel like monsters, right?
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that we never talked about publicly before that we have been talking about, right? Assault, right? Who would you choose, the man or the bear? Right.
Oh, I just got to chill. Yeah, I talked about that on a podcast episode, and it what you just said makes a lot of sense, because anytime I try to have that conversation with a man about that topic, they like everyone got defensive immediately, couldn't even have the conversation. But it makes sense if they have internalized shame because men have been ex- the toxic masculinity has been exposed. And so if they have shame around it, and even having the conversation, if it triggers like, I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm a monster, I can see why they're not wanting to have that conversation. And another thing that happened recently, and we'll wrap this up so we can get back into the FLRs, but I want to say this last thing. So someone that I used to follow that I love, like absolutely love, Justin Baldoni, he is an advocate for women, right? Speaks out a lot about like women's rights and autonomy and things like that. But then he had that lawsuit with Blake Lively. And that crushed my heart because like in my mind, he's a good guy, right? A good guy advocating for women. So I feel like men have been, some of it is valid, obviously, but men have been taking a beating in a way of like, they like painting them as monsters. So I can understand why it's such a delicate topic and why men become defensive when you start bringing these things up.
And I just wanted to add, that's such a great point. I honestly understand now one of the things that I've come to terms with as well when it comes to the nice guy trope is that I don't think men know other men.
Mm.
Like women, we are communal creatures. We have close, intimate friendships. We're close with parents and aunts and things like this. And I think a lot of men, they don't intimately know other men. And so when they're seeing, a Diddy or a Justin
Ugh,
Baldoni
yeah.
right out and for them, and when it came up about Diddy, I had male friends who were like, I don't know if he's guilty. And I'm like, I couldn't believe it. And they didn't believe it until there was video proof.
Mm.
Right. And the reason that it was so hard for them to believe is because if he is like that, what does that really reflect about me? Right. This person who was like seemingly like, a pinnacle in masculinity, right?
Mhm.
And wealth and prosperity.
Mhm.
And it's now being mirrored back to them. There was DL Hughley, he was on a podcast, and his best friend assaulted his daughter. And he talked about how he did not believe his daughter.
Oh my God. I didn't hear about that one. Wow.
He didn't believe his daughter. And it's because who men are in their friendships and in the barbershop and at work is not who they are. I was like, men lower their mask and reveal them true selves, typically in their most intimate relationships, which is typically
Mm.
one-to-one with women.
And think about how much women have to hold. That's that unspoken emotional labor that's why it'll never be equal, right? Because there's so much that women have to hold. When I think about Cassie and how much she witnessed and went through with Diddy and having to hold that, that is a lot. Like that is a lot. And women can endure that and still get up and be beautiful and put a smile on their face. Like I'm getting emotional. I just this is the perfect segue to go back into the FLR. That is why I think now that I've discovered this whole world, I don't think I can date a man that's not of the mindset of an FLR because men seeing women as sacred, I just feel like their energy is completely different. So I discovered the FLR. I went down this rabbit hole, and because I was listening to podcasts and like searching things online, then stuff started popping up because algorithms and they're listening and watching everything we do. So I found dating apps that are FLR based, and of course, I was like, okay, I gotta see what this is like. So I joined this dating app that's all about FLRs, and the profiles, even just what men were saying on the profiles, is a world of difference than what you see on Hinge and, Facebook dating and all of that. Like I want to find my queen and I just want to pour into her so she can be the best that she can be. I don't want her to have to worry about anything. I'm just like, oh my God, where has this been my whole entire life? But before I discovered that app, I had to figure some things out in my mind because when I first heard FLR, my brain automatically went to subs and doms, which I think most people's brain does go to that because that's most people's experience with the term. But I realized that there's a difference in a dom sub dynamic. So we're not talking about sex workers here, just in case anyone is going that route. We're not talking about a woman paying a man paying a woman to beat him or anything like that. I mean, if that's what you're into, but that's not what we're talking about here. But there are actual sub-dom relationships and even marriages. So some people adapt that archetype for their actual real relationship, and it's not like a sex worker type of thing. But the difference between that and an FLR, sometimes the sub is a little more, I don't want to say submissive because that's obvious, but a little more like feminine, or it could be a certain dynamic where they are maybe doing all of the housework type of stuff, but the dom is still creating a dynamic. So she's still kind of doing work. And I had to figure out for myself that what I want is a masculine man, because it took me some trial and error to learn this, but I want a masculine man that wants to be of service to me, to his queen, right? The way that I see my life, and this may not work for everyone, but I think it's important that we explore what works for us. But me being a business owner, running 2 businesses, I have 2 podcasts, I'm busy, I have a lot on my plate. So if a man came in and wanted unspoken domestic labor from me, they're not going to get it. Like that traditional relationship thing, just, it's not going to work for me. Never has, which is why I've been single for so long. But a man that's like, I see what you are creating in the world. I see your purpose. I see the legacy that you're building, and I want to be of support to that and to you. And I want to pour into you so you can shine your light in the world as brightly as possible. Like, that's what I want. And I feel like when I got on the dating app, saying that was received easily. And they're like, oh, I'd be honored. Whereas I feel like if I were to say something like that on like Hinge or, Bumble or something like that, guys are gonna be like, oh my God, I don't want to be needed. Like, no, like she's too much. She's high maintenance. She's high maintenance. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I know I said a lot.
Interesting. I'm gonna need that app. No. So really intriguing to me how kind of that thread of history comes back in, because I think that historically people have ideas about relationships and don't necessarily trace like the truth of relationships. And for me, I have been an entrepreneur as well for over 10 years, and one of my first businesses was actually me working in for really wealthy high net worth clientele. And it got me to thinking about like traditionalism, domestic labor, and things like that. And for the most part, unless you were impoverished, like women did not clean their own houses, right? They did not cook dinner for the family every night, right? That's not a thing. And it's still not the case for upper middle class and above households, right? But I have found through my own relationships, I was, going out on dates with someone who was a professional athlete, and he was like, my mother took care of 3 teenage sons and worked 2 jobs by herself and came home and cooked and cleaned and did all of the things. And I was like, I don't believe in like domestic help. And I was like, we are we are never going to go any further than
Yeah.
having dinner. because, because we're never going further than having dinner, right? Because why would you want to impose that labor? And so I think there is this difference of like when we talk about masculinity, right? I think that there is this presumed like idea of masculinity that a lot of men have. Like it's kind of like fantastical, right? Like men do this and women do this. And it's not necessarily something that they saw in action, like not even in their households or their families. It really has just kind of just been something they've created. right? And then project it onto others. So it's interesting to, for even us to say, like, what does masculine look like when it's laying down, not charging that to women, wanting to take care of, wanting to nurture. And ultimately, what I believe happens in the FLR is what happens when a man is devotional,
Mm.
right? And historically, romantic relationships were, even the history of romance was rooted in the devotional masculine. Right?
Mm.
He was devotional to the woman. He wanted to prove himself, right?
Mm.
Worthy of her love, worthy of her attention, worthy of her affection. And so we don't necessarily have to have that influx of like worthiness, but I think that that works. Like when men are devotional and in service too, because the feminine is already socialized to be in service too. So while you say like you may not be the woman who's going to like stay home and clean the house and cook the meals, there's no way that you're partnered with someone and you don't consider whether or not they've eaten for the day. Like it's just kind of like a natural question, like, hey, did you have dinner? And I might not cook the dinner, but it's like, oh, like let's go out here, or we're going to make sure that that thing happens, and it's not necessarily caretaking. I think it's just something that naturally happens, and so when we see men actively choosing to recondition themselves, I think that's when the FLR takes place.
Mm. Yeah, I tried to explain to a couple of guys that I had conversations with about this, where if you genuinely pour into a woman's going to flourish and she's going to take care of you naturally. But what I found, the last guy that I dated said the things, like, yeah, let me pour into you. I just want to love you while you go save the world. But I think men are catching on of the right things to say, but they haven't learned the true actions yet, and it being grounded. I don't know if that makes sense, but one thing that I have noticed with myself is I'm in a place where I'm like super sensitive to energy. I do energy work. I'm, playing sound bowls at my studio every day, working on my embodiment, really listening to my body. So if someone's actions are rooted in expectation or manipulation, or even if someone says one thing, I can feel if it's not aligned, right? So I'll give like a specific example. After a long day of work and I come home, I'm exhausted, I ask for a massage. The guy I'm dating gives me a massage, but is trying to have sex. We're all adults here, so there's no one under 18 that listens to this podcast. Hopefully not, I don't think so. So it's a difference in a man giving a woman a massage because he's trying to get some, versus a man giving a woman a massage because he understands she's exhausted, her body is tired, and her body's sacred, and he wants to nurture her and her body. And I mean, of course, men want sex, right? But so does women. But he's doing it to actually nurture her and not doing it just to get some, or like using that as foreplay, right? There's a difference. It's a nuance that I can feel, right? I can feel when it's really grounded in, I want to pour into you, versus let me go through this motion just so I can get what I want, right? So I find that the men that are into FLRs are like, I want to take care of you. And it's not take care of you financially. It's not about that. It's about, I want to pour into you. I want to like you use the word devotional. Like they are more devotional. And I just it's almost like I just discovered like I just discovered this thing that like I had no idea existed, but I'm like, I don't think I could ever date another man that's like not into like this energy, this way of thinking. But trying to explain it to a man who hasn't been exposed to it or have done the work, it's like they don't get it. It's crazy.
I think explaining it to them sounds like complaining,
Hmm.
right? I think that that's how it's like typically absorbed, right? And until I think men learn how to hear women, right, that will always energetically come up, right? Because it feels like, oh, another task, another thing I have to do. And I really find that it is the men who want to do it, right? Who naturally find themselves going down the path that leads them there. And so for me, it always goes back to what self work have you been doing? Because for me, it leads to also what have you been deconstructing, right? Because majority of men don't know how to experience intimacy outside of a sexual scenario, right? And so closeness and proximity having to always lead to something sexual, them being hypersexualized and them bringing that energy into the relationship, it's a reflection of an internal woundedness, right? And so that's why when we were talking about sacred union and you asked me what it means to me, I do truly believe that it comes back into wholeness. Have you balanced your relationship with your internal masculine and feminine energetics? Because it's not until you understand your internal feminine needs that you could ever understand what a woman is asking you for or requesting of you energetically. So that to me reads as an internal imbalance energetically.
I 1,000% agree. And I want to paint a picture. Bear with me because I haven't articulated this, but I almost feel like if a man views it as complaining, it creates resentment. And it's because he is not under, like you said, understanding his own needs. Men are programmed to just be sexual beings, and what a lot of men want and need is nurturing and a connection to their emotional self. A lot of men are not connected to their emotions. They're not socialized, like you said. So, as a business owner, I teach this in my certification, but I've also just gone through it in my own journey as an entrepreneur. When I have a good work life balance and a client asks me for something, I give it willingly and I'm happy and I'm not annoyed or impatient or anything like that. But when I'm burnt out and I'm exhausted and I haven't had a day off, a client asks me for something and it feels like a lot, because it's beyond my capacity. And what happens is I feel resentment internally. It takes a lot of self awareness to be able to identify that and admit it. And so I think that that is what's happening with men. They're not connected to their own needs and emotions and desires and capacity. And when I say desires, people like men all think like, yeah, men want sex, right? Like we think that. But there's so many layers beyond just that. And when they're not connected to their true desires and their emotions, anything a woman asks of them is going to feel like a chore. But they have to do the inner work to even be able to peel those layers back to understand it, you know?
Absolutely. Especially if they experienced a childhood like most people have where they had unmet needs,
And that
right?
that's exactly what it is. Exact. So just like the example I gave with my business, my unmet need is like I need a break, I need a day off, I need rest, I need I need fun, like pouring into my zest for life and enjoying the fruits of my labor. And when I don't have my needs met as an individual, it makes it really hard for me to show up for my business and my clients in the way that I want to. And that creates resentment. So I think that that's what's happening in relationships, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that men are constantly hearing the word, I need, I need, I need, I need.
Mm-hmm.
And they have always had unmet needs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then there's this resentment of, I never had my needs met. Why
Mm-hmm.
should I meet yours?
Exactly. Yep. And that's why these men are saying, I don't want a woman who needs me.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the reflection of their own unmet needs. And we have to understand when we're coming into relationship with people, it really works as a mirror. So the level up from the work that I do of Gene Keys is I actually do work around mapping people's masculine and feminine energetics.
Mm.
And when I do that with a client and we really talk about how we bring those things into wholeness, a lot of what is revealed is what are the shadow frequencies in your feminine energy and in your masculine energy that we are healing through these like astrological placements, right? Because the wounding always shows up in the karma, right? Like I can literally map the things that happen to people in their childhood and throughout their lifetime. And so when we're looking at that woundedness, we're so focused on healing, right? That we never actually start the living, which is also why there's this unhealthy rhetoric of like, oh, you have to come to the relationship healed, right? When most people, they think that they're healing, they think that they're doing all of this work, and then they get into a relationship and they become triggered.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that individualized work that they think that they did becomes unraveled. Because really, as humans, we're actually meant to heal collectively. We even see this in hospitals. The patients who heal the fastest are the people who have people coming to visit them, coming to see them, right? Them being in community is actually a healing balm. It's the same thing in relationships, right? It is when we have the things mirrored back to us that we can consciously do the work on the things that have been existing beneath the surface unconsciously until we have this mirror in front of us in order to do it. And that's a part of the sacred union as well. When you get into the sacred union and you come whole, that doesn't mean that the work is done, that there's no work left to do. It's just that you have two people who are capable and willing to do it and to be transparent and accountable and responsible for their role in the work.
Yeah. What would you say is the psychology behind or the difference in a man who is just like, what is this FLR crap versus like a man who's like, yes, this is how it should be.
A man who honors and understands wisdom over intellect, because that's truly what I feel like is coming back into the collective. We have put intellect above all, we put the mind above all, and we have sidelined intuition and divine wisdom. And so it is the masculine who looks at the feminine and sees her ease, sees her wisdom, sees her intuition, sees those ancestral pictures on her altar, and says, this is something here that I may not fully understand or have access to. And I trust the feminine, right? I think it comes down to trust. And I think that the word lead or led can be really jarring. So for me in my relationships, I've been using the language of like female guided relationship, at least specifically for me, because that is really what I'm offering. I'm offering the guidance.
Yeah. There was this term I wanted to put on a graphic, not a term, a sentence I wanted to put on a graphic. A woman's nurturing energy can be a catalyst for a man's growth, but only if he's open to evolving alongside of her. So I do feel like a woman's intuition and her wisdom can truly help a man fully step into his power. But I think that so many women are trying to fix, and I'm going to
Mhm.
say boys, not even men, trying to fix boys, and it doesn't work. And it also leads to resentment. So I think that the concept of the FLR works for me because I know the work that I do and I know the power that I have. And any man that comes into my life is going to be better being, with someone like me. I know this. And I also know my capacity, so I need a man that is willing to pour into me, nurture me, because I know he's going to benefit from being with me just in general. And I don't say that in, like a cocky way. But I think that anytime you hear like a man that's been really successful, but an embodied man, a grounded embodied man, he always says his partner is what really helped him step into the man that he was meant to be or capable of being. But I think that there's so many wounded boys, and I say boys, I don't mean that in an insulting way. It's that men haven't done the inner child healing. So hopefully, if any man is listening to this, they don't get offended by me saying boys, but it's that wounded inner child, which we all have, but women are doing more inner child healing than men, and it's more normal. It's more normal for us to talk to our inner child and connect with our inner child. So I would love to see more men doing inner child healing, which is why I have the Healthy Love Healing app. Quick plug there. It is inner child healing and shadow work for men as well as women. And it looks different, right? The inner work looks different for a man versus a woman. I think that it's important that men do that inner child healing and is committed to his own growth, because I think women have been carrying so much weight for men that they're exhausted. We're exhausted. And so many women are getting autoimmune diseases. Obviously my studio focuses on wellness, and the amount of autoimmune diseases that women are experiencing is because we're burnt out. We can't carry all of the weight, especially now that men are saying, I don't want a woman that needs me, and they're not providing the way they used to. So now we're having to provide financially and still carry all of this unspoken weight of relationships. Like, women are burnt out.
It's interesting because I think that there are different archetypes of men for sure, especially when it comes to being wanting to be needed or wanting to not be needed. And I, like you said, like everyone is wounded, but I think that this is coming up often in the conversation, which is that burnout, right? And I think there's almost like a dual burnout, right? I think the women are burnt out from the emotional labor, from, the overgiving and the overdoing, which are shadow frequencies of the wounded feminine, right? And we have been in these roles where we're like, well, I have to prove that I'm worthy. I have to prove that I'm contributing, that I'm here doing something, right? Because even though we have been handicapped from our natural, gifts, which is guidance, which is wisdom, which is counter, which is in communion with the masculine, right? Typically, the feminine energy, it doesn't heal the masculine, it guides the masculine to where he needs to go in order to heal himself.
Love that.
So I always say I can be the test in the testimony. I'm a portal guardian for you to walk through this portal and to heal thyself, right? And come back into your wholeness. But I cannot do the work for you. I can hold the space for you. I can light the flame for you. I can guide you to my altar, right? But ultimately, you're the one that's going to have to bend the knee. And I think that that's really what is necessary right now, and why this frequency is coming online is because the masculine is now meeting that test through the feminine, right? That test of, am I going to heal this, or am I going to try to uphold the hierarchy even though I see it crumbling? This is actually a frequency that's playing out through the gene keys as well,
Oh,
through the
interesting.
evolution. There's a gene key, it's called gene key 37. And this gene key, it calls for the end of female oppression, right? Um,
Oh.
and it is evolving through relationships and through the family dynamics. And it talks about how, in familial roles, why the patriarchy was structured, these survival tactics, these mechanisms. In indigenous cultures, we knew our roles, right? We knew that it was the feminine intuition and the guidance who could tell the man exactly where to go get the best kill. Because she was so in tune with the earth, so in tune with nature, right? When we were hunters or gatherers, it was the women who decided when it was time to pack up the camp and move on to somewhere else, right? Like that indigenous information was so much a part of our everyday daily lives. And once we got away from that and we were held in the container of these hierarchical structures, right, that come top down, right? When man is now ruled over by government and we now have these families who are being framed throughout that. We are really now reclaiming that as the government and the empires begin to crumble and we come back into a space of healthy relationship, healthy interdependence, right? How can we coexist and healthily rely on one another, right? Because this is a mutual thing, right? The masculine also is going to recognize that it needs the feminine, right? The masculine needs the support, right? It also needs a space to soften without shame, right? It needs the experience of what is it like to follow? What is it like to not have to make all of the decisions? We are experiencing a male mental health crises, right? Men are experiencing more loneliness than ever, right? Their anxiousness, right? Depression, right? There is a male suicide, right, epidemic right now. And those are all very real things because they are feeling the crushing weight, right? And this Jinky talks about that, and it's really coded for the liberation of us all, right? And we are really waiting for the masculine to decide, not that it's time to liberate us, but that it's time to liberate themselves, right? Because once they get free and they let that go, they let that role go that they think that they are supposed to become, that they think they are supposed to be playing out, we can truly come back into a space of that equitable, intimate partnership.
So 37 used to be my favorite number because 3 was my favorite number and also 7. So 37 was one of my favorite numbers. So I love this gene key. But I love everything about that. And I just want to say to you, you have such a beautiful way of holding space for the masculine. Because I think women, myself included, I can be like, but women, we gotta like help the women. And even though I understand both sides need work, you have a beautiful way of just saying, we both need to be held and seen and liberated. So I love when you bring it back to like men also need to be liberated because I think sometimes it's very easy for us as women to just understand our part of it, but I love that you speak to men's part of it because I think that a man's a man saying it sometimes won't be as eloquent. He may not articulate it the way that you do in a way that is received by women. Does that make sense? So I feel like I don't know if I said that properly, but I feel like you have a beautiful way of speaking to what the masculine need in a way that can be received well by women, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You have the 37 gene key, by the way.
That was my next question. Is that in my chart? Because I feel like this whole healthy love, like the healthy love method, I feel like is literally my soul's purpose. Like I feel like it is my soul's purpose. So yeah, say more. Okay, tell me
Yeah.
about this
Well,
GP at my
well,
chart.
it's actually in your Venus sequence. It's your
Yes,
you.
it makes so
So
much sense.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you have that 37 and that information is currently like being revolutionized. It's coming through the collective frequency. And so we feel it more than ever. And so you being focused on the feminine makes complete sense because that's what the 37 is all about. It is, saying, hey, we have to liberate the feminine from these chains and these shackles. Um, my purpose just happens to be the 49, which is also it's the jinky of revolution, and I am here revolutionizing relationships. And so, with those frequencies currently coming through the collective, when you look at relationships as the cornerstone of society that they are, these become more and more important, right? So I hold space for the masculine because I just have a lot of energetics that I'm an initiator of the masculine. I like have a lot of goddess and priestess energy that talks about walking men to the fire, walking them to the flame. And I'm really supporting women also in open-heartedness because through our wounded masculine within us, so many of us have shut down. We have shut down. We have closed our hearts. Not to say that there wasn't reason for that happening, but when the masculine is coming to the feminine and they are looking to soften, oftentimes they are being met by hardness, right? And the feminine is calling out, be vulnerable with me, let your guard down. And the masculine is like, that is terrifying. Why would I do that? Right? And so it is through my own softening that I'm able to hold space and also not sacrifice myself on the altar of their salvation either, right? So it's calling the masculine to take accountability for themselves, right? Calling them into their natural roles, calling them back to themselves by not saving them, right? I'm not going to save you. I'm not going to overgive. I'm not going to overdo. I've healed those parts of myself. I definitely have relationships where that was a part of it, right? And it is through these types of relationships that I'm finding balance of that, where I'm feeling reinvigorated and re-empowered, right? To stand fully in my power, to not shrink myself. And through not shrinking myself, I can say to the masculine, I can meet you in love. You can meet me in love. And this is what is required of you. Transparency is required of you, right? Going through these tests and testimonies, that is required of you in order to meet me here and for us to really cultivate this sacred union that is the portal for the abundance and prosperity that the masculine has been chasing. It's right here. It is in connection. It is through relationships that we can obtain the things that we, imagine, right? Because everyone right now is feeling like they are struggling as an individual. And like, it makes perfect sense that we are struggling as individuals because we are not meant to live that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Do you feel like an FLR is a step in the right direction of the sacred union?
I do. I think it's a step in the right direction. I feel like it's an evolution, but I think that it has to be reframed because I think a lot of people, when they think FLR, they think power exchange. They think authority transfer. And I think
Yeah,
that's its own slippery slope.
yeah,
Like,
and that I think that's why it was important for me to, and I know we talked about so many other things, so I'll probably have a follow-up episode where I'm diving deeper into what an FLR is and what it isn't. But I will say the same way like you say polyamory, people have so many different variations of it, right? Like so many different variations of it. So I think it's the same thing with FLR. You're going to have different variations, different levels. But for me, it's not about a power dynamic. I think I realized like I need a devotional man. I need a man to pour into me willingly and not, with resentment and not begrudgingly. I want a man that's just like, I know you work hard. I see how tired you are. I see how exhausted you are. I want to take care of you and it not just be going through the motions for sex. And really, I feel like I feel like it's how it should be, and it shouldn't be that this like taboo kink lifestyle, you know? When it really comes down to it, I want a man that has done enough inner work that understands pouring into a woman is going to create a healthy dynamic for everyone, because women are tired and burnt out. But same thing, men are also burnt out.
It's interesting because I think in the FLRs that are conscious, right? I think it's creating a space for the masculine to become. And when I say become, I really think that there is a a type of masculine that hasn't necessarily had the space to grow and or flourish, that has been shamed, that has been, made to feel guilty, you know, for certain longings, for certain wants, for certain desires. And so the feminine coming in and having a reclamation moment where she's fully embodying what is natural, right? I think if we just get back into nature, right, I think that the sacred feminine is receptive and is wise and she's intuitive, right? And if so, if the feminine is closest to the veil, right, and has access to all of this wisdom and knowing and is able to acknowledge that, and it provides a space of relaxation for both partners, why not lean into that?
Yeah.
Right? I don't think that there's been enough of a framing of FLRs in the context of like what they do for the masculine,
Yeah.
right? Like what are the benefits of it, right? Because I think when you look into FLRs, there's a lot of benefits for the feminine, but there are a lot of benefits there for the masculine as well and for the masculine's healing.
Yeah. What would you say some of those benefits are?
Um, really being able to release the pressures that were placed on him through society, right? That have stunted his growth and evolution, right? I think that in this matrix that we live in, if you keep the masculine kind of caught up, like chasing out in the world, then they are disconnected from the feminine. There is no, union. There is no oneness there when you're consistently and constantly chasing. We didn't even bring in the frequency and energetics of money and how that plays a role in all of this, but it is a very much so looming factor. What would happen if the masculine realized that he didn't need to chase money or work so much to be prosperous? The feminine has already realized that. That's why the women are getting back into a space of ease,
Yeah.
right? Like, what happens if the masculine comes back and learns that from the feminine and learns relaxation, and learns how to call in? We manifestation has become such a buzzword, but I think that we miss the mark when we forget that it is mutual manifestation, of course, within couples, but also in communities and family units, right? You will really, some people really struggle with that understanding of like, sure, we can manifest for ourselves, but like, you know, energetically, do you need $1 billion for just you? Like, when
Yeah.
we think about the things that we're like, wanting to call in, wanting to manifest, when we start calling in things that are selfless, right? When we start leaning into tenderness and transparency and trust, I think that that's what the FLR gives the masculine space for, right? To heal, one, to heal the mother wound. We talk about father wounds a lot, but the mother wound is pervasive. So having a space for the masculine to heal the relationship, his first relationship with feminine guidance, right? There are so many mothers who are struggling with mental health issues, anger issues, their own intimate frustrations and things like that, and took it out on their sons, right? We have to hold room for that. I was this week just doing research on Generation X. I'm in that kind of age range, which is really interesting, where I'm dating millennials and Gen X. And
Mm,
something pervasive that kept coming up for me with men from Generation X is that so many of them have very deep mother wounds. And I
mm,
wanted to understand where that came from. And I
mhm,
was like, I think there's something societal here. There's something in the infrastructure of how these men were raised. And
mm,
really, what it was is so many of them were in households where for the first time, women could leave abusive relationships. Their
mm,
mothers were now having, economic independence. They were able to leave their abuser. They were able to start to heal from their abuser. Some of their mothers like just left the home altogether and left them with their paternal figure. Like a lot of things were changing when it came to households and relationships for Generation X. And there's a lot of anger there when it comes to the masculine and healing that relationship with the feminine. So, what would it be like to be in a safe container with the divine, sacred feminine who is leading you through nurturing, through tenderness, through compassion, and through care?
yeah. Man, you be dropping the gems. So much that you just said, but what I do feel is that there's so much anger and resentment between, like, in relationships between men and women. Men are wounded and angry at women. I feel like women are wounded and angry at men. And I think that going back to the concept of a sacred union, we have to heal that in relationships. And it's not going to happen if women just do their work on their own, because if you do work, if you do inner work and you're isolated, it's just theory until you're actually in that relationship, right? I feel like we kind of touched on that when we did the previous interview. When you're in relationship, you can work together to heal the wounds, to unpack that programming. And I really think it just takes two individuals being open and vulnerable, but also having the resources and tools to be able to work through it, because I feel like it's a skill set to be able to unpack this stuff. So if you don't have the skill set of healthy conflict resolution, working with someone like yourself or a therapist or a healer, a quality coach to unpack it. But what I find is there's so much anger and resentment in relationships, and we can blame it on the dating apps, we can blame it on social media, but really the programming is, it's crumbling. And I don't think a lot of people know what to do with that. But I do feel like we are taking steps in the right direction. There's so much programming that is being unlearned. And I think two individuals entering into an FLR, I think, are open to the conversation and unlearning the old dynamics that aren't working. And then I get this visual when I start talking about it. I don't know if it was like Greek mythology, but you remember when women would be like lifted up, and then there's like men fanning her and like feeding her grapes. Like, there was a time where women were worshipped, right? Like, it's not a new thing, but we got out of it because of the patriarchy and the structures that were built to oppress women. So going back to when women were like worshipped, and I know worship, it's a word that some people may be uncomfortable with and some may not.
Well, I also think the question that comes up for me, and I think for most listeners, has to be, what do you want the relationship for? Right? Because I think we're talking about some pretty high level stuff, right? And I think an FLR is for a very specific, intentional type of woman, right? I always joke and say, I think that when you're doing a certain level of spiritual work, you come to a point where you heal yourself out of the dating pool, it feels like. right? Especially if you are dating the masculine. So the question then becomes not necessarily, are you willing to allow me to overpower you? Are you willing to honor my intuition and allow me to guide our relationship? And I had to be very intentional with that in my relationships because I was encountering partnerships where they would enjoy the fruits of my intuition when it was convenient, but then they would want to push it away and reject it when it was uncomfortable for them, when it was calling them towards evolution or calling them towards growth.
That's it. Yeah.
And so that's at the front end of my relationships now. Are you open to me guiding from my feminine intuition in this relationship? Is that on the table? Because there is no relationship with me without that. Because I need the space not only for you to worship me or be devoted to me, I need the space in the room to show up as my fullest, most honest, most transparent self. And I think the ways that relationship functioned before required a lot of dishonesty from the feminine. Dishonesty was a requirement. It's why we oftentimes require men to lie to us because we were required to lie to them.
Yeah. Whew. All right. We talked about so much. Oh my goodness, so many gems here. I feel like I want to listen back to this and just absorb all of the gems that you dropped in this episode. What are action steps that both men and women can take towards that sacred union? Because I feel like at our core that's what we all want. So any last statement and ways we can work towards a sacred union?
The future of relationships is radically transparent and honest to this point where you will not be able to show up in relationship as any muted or dishonest version of yourself. And so foundationally, that's what I would leave with most people is how can you start to create the space to one, be honest with yourself, confront your desires, and then co-create them with someone else. But you have to come raw, you have to come real. And it's not just about the good things about yourself, the wonderful ways in which you have healed, all of the work that you have done. It is the nitty-gritty things you do not want anyone else to know about you that you have to bring to the relationship as well. And it is through that portal of transparency and honesty that sacred union truly manifests. Because you cannot find your way to the light without first holding the shadow close.
So good. So good. Yeah. I know I said that was my last thing, but what does an embodied man look like to you? Because I know I work with women on embodiment, but I feel like men connecting to themselves and their desires is important too. So, do people say that like an embodied man?
I think so. I think an embodied man, the embodied masculine, right? And I think an embodied man has balanced and come to terms with the fact that he has feminine energy. There has been a lot of sidelining and shame constructs rooted in bringing the masculine into wholeness, right? And that's been by caging his feminine, qualities. And so a fully embodied man has addressed that, right? Has deconstructed that and has brought himself back into a space of comfort, right? And the healing of his nervous system when it comes to expressing those qualities through himself, right? Where does that show up in his body? How does he feel when he's in the presence of femininity and he feels his own femininity rising to the surface, right? And that requires, the his feminine counterpart to also have brought herself into wholeness with her masculinity. So that's what an embodied masculine looks like to me. He's no longer suppressing those qualities, but they are well balanced and they are healthy.
Mm. It's so interesting. I know when I date and I say like I'm looking for emotional safety and nurturing, I don't think men even know what that is, but it's because they've been conditioned to not be in that feminine energy because nurturing is feminine energy. Emotional safety and vulnerability, these are feminine qualities that men have been conditioned out of. So I'm actually asking of them something that that goes against, the programming. So it makes so much sense. Oh my goodness. I love talking to you. Obviously, I could talk to you forever.
I love talking to you as well. Thank you so much for inviting me back. I always have a blast chatting with you.
Thank you. This has been so good. So, just to remind people, just in case they didn't listen to the previous episode, you do Gene Keys readings, human design, a little bit of astrology too. So, go ahead and give a plug if someone is like, man, this woman is amazing. You're an oracle, goddess, queen. And they're like, I want to learn more. I want to dive into my Gene Keys. How can they find you?
Absolutely. So, yes, I do Gene Keys and I also do human design strategy. Gene Keys, what that really does look like is it is energetic tracking and also ancestral reclamation work. So, there's a lot of things that go into Gene Keys that if you Googled it, wouldn't necessarily come up in relationship to like what I do with Gene Keys. So you can always look me up on social media at Cheri Calico. You can book a discovery call with me. They're absolutely free, and we can really touch base on what it is that you are looking to do when it comes to recognizing and owning your energetics, right? Who are you at a DNA cellular level, and how is that story being expressed consciously in your life right now?
Yes, and if you can't tell, she is brilliant. And she does work with men. So if you are a man listening and you got through this whole episode, first of all, cheers to you. And second, if you want to start to unpack this more, definitely reach out to her. I love the space that you are holding for men. We definitely need more of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Abundance Hack Show. I would love to hear from you. Leave your comments and questions, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our yummy episodes. Every time you leave a 5-star rating or review, I do my happy dance.